Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you, Colonel John Spencer, to Israel. You're perhaps the world's expert on urban warfare. We're engaged right now in intense urban warfare in Gaza, and I appreciate the opportunity to glean from your insights and to answer some questions you might have. So welcome.
Thank you, sir. And thank you each time that I've been welcomed to Israel, and what an honor, to be honest, to interview you during one of the most, I think, historic wars of our generation in general. And I hope I can explain that to other people, but never had an opportunity to ask a world leader during a war, a generational war, what I think is a generational war that is an urban war, because that's what I study, sir. But what I like to tell people is I throw people who forget the wars of last 5 years ago, 20 years ago, especially 70 years ago.
Well, you mentioned the Battle of Manila.
Yes, sir.
And I found that particularly instructive, because here you had a city half the scale of Gaza. Manila was 1.1 million. Yes, Gaza sir. Today is 2.2 million. Gaza and its various parts. And there were 17,000 Japanese troops there. Well, there are twice that many Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists, about 35,000. So there was a tunnel system there. We have an vast underground terror tunnel system. And what I learned from you is they had a tunnel system, which was the sewage.
Yes, sir.
Now you look at I think the interesting thing is how many civilian casualties were incurred there and how many civilian casualties are incurred here. That I think is the most instructive thing, and that I learned from you.
Well, thank you, sir. It's unfortunate how people forget history of what is the realm of possible when you have an embedded enemy, especially of that size, in a network of tunnels, which I've written about as well, sir, that while there were tunnels in Manila, and the Japanese did connect the sewers to fighting positions, but they were also going to embed themselves in there, and you had to go in and get them out. And I think, which is really one of my first questions, the reason in which the Battle of Manila had to happen is that there were over 1,000 American prisoners of war.
Basically hostages.
And 2,000 civilians, both American and British, being held by the Japanese for years, being tortured. So General MacArthur he didn't want to destroy Manila. He loved Manila. His father served there, he served there. But he knew that the Americans needed to be saved. So they started the operation, and 100,000 people died in that battle.
100,000 people?
100,000.
Okay. We have incurred considerably fewer, and I'm glad we've incurred fewer, because my instructions and the cabinet's instruction, the war cabinet instructions to the Army, is to do everything to minimize civilian casualties. We have incurred probably around 16,000 civilian casualties. Each one is a tragedy. The ratio to combatants killed is now down to less than 1 to 1. Now down less than 1 to 1. But we're facing, I think, a tougher situation than the American Army faced in Manila,
sure.
Because this is a deeply entrenched enemy that takes the militarized, to use, I think, your language. They militarized all of Gaza. They took the hospitals, the schools, the residential quarters, the above ground and the underground space, and turned it into one huge terrorist compound. And we have to come in there while they're trying to keep the population in place as a human shield and root them out. And we're doing it with far fewer casualties than the only equivalent battle that I can see, which is Manila. That's the one that's close, because when I look at Mosul, it's not even close. Nope. Mosul had no underground terror system and had only 3,000 to 5,000 terrorists. Is that right?
That's right, sir.
That's it, about that.
3,000 to 5,000.
And still 10,000 people died.
Yes.
10,000 civilians died there.
And 10,000 soldiers to take the city.
I see, okay.
So it was So in the Battle of Manila, we only lost 1,000 American soldiers taking the city. But the Iraqi security forces lost 10,000 soldiers to defeat 3,000 ISIS fighters.
Well, I think we're doing better. And I can tell you that in our situation, victory is within reach. It's not a distant victory. It's within reach. We've destroyed 3/4 of the terrorist fighting battalions of Hamas. We have another quarter to go. That's two battalions in the center of the Gaza Strip, 4 in Rafah, and we intend to complete the job while evacuating the civilians and while taking care to provide them humanitarian aid.
I think one of the differences too, sir, and I tried to explain that there is no historical precedence. There is no example in the history of war to compare the context of the war in Gaza. Not in the size of the enemy, not in the tunnels he built, but we're also forgetting, I've never studied a war where there are rockets emanating from the war zone hitting the civilian areas, every one of them a war crime, of the military attacking that in other enemy force. It's just, there's no precedence to that either.
Well, you also mentioned the fact that we're giving the enemy advance warning because in order to evacuate the civilians, we are sending leaflets, showering really the residential quarters with leaflets and also phone calls.
Yes, sir.
Thousands and thousands of phone calls to their cell phones telling them leave. So Hamas knows exactly where we're coming in, when we're coming in.
And I think people think that I want to talk about that, sir, because I actually fear, having understood and have a better understanding of how Israel did that, is that it's not repeatable. And that
why not?
One is strategic. You, sir, would give the strategic objectives for the military, let's say to defeat the enemy. Mm-hmm. And the number one thing that's going to do that is surprise and violence of action. So the first step is that there's a belief that you always have to give warning. We didn't give warning in the battle to invade Panama. We did not give warning in Afghanistan. We did not give warning in Iraq. Because the Western way of warfare is through shock and awe and speed. So if you say, well, I know that, but I'm going to do the moral thing and evacuate the cities, but that's also going to mean that this is going to I'm giving away all my military advantage and actually not using that speed, overwhelming force that we have used in almost every other war. The giving warning, although it's been a normal thing in counter-terror operations, when you have time and you control the area. So one, giving warning, and two, just all that Israel has done with the handing out of the military maps. And I actually learned more recently, not only is it giving out its military maps, but certain quadrants now have to have the Chief of Staff of the Army's authority even to go into that quadrant, or your permission, because of the number of, that level of fidelity of the population, and then telling the enemy, like, I'm not going to go into that area because there's people there, so why would the enemy let people leave? Or telling the enemy, as a military guy who served 25 years, that the enemy will always know where we're going to be. Literally, Sun Tzu said, the greatest thing is surprise and intelligence.
No question. Well, I think what you're stressing here is that Israel is taking unprecedented steps to prevent civilian casualties. Yet in the world press and in the various absurd protests that are launched against Israel by supporters of Hamas, supporters of this genocidal terrorist organization who are accusing Israel of genocide, while Israel is taking unparalleled measures to avoid civilian casualties. And I think you need somebody, a military historian like yourself, to compare this to other arenas, to other battles, to other arenas of urban warfare, to see how unusual the steps that we're taking are. And I think that's just a way to cast light on this area that is deliberately being obscured and falsified by those people who want to attack Israel. In fact, what they're doing is they're attacking the army. They're using a double standard to attack the army that has set a gold standard for trying to minimize civilian casualties.
A standard which I fear is not. I actually, as somebody who studies this, I've actually seen there's even an initiative out there to ban the use of explosive weapons in urban areas, because people don't want civilian casualties. Although the UN statistic for the last 20 years on who are the casualties of war, 90% of them are civilians.
Well, Colonel Spencer, what this means if you adopt that principle, it means that the terrorists have absolute immunity.
That's right.
Because I think more than half the world's population live in cities, right?
That's right. Over.
Okay, so
most of the developed world is
likely
over.
arenas, and you see that everywhere, likely arenas are urban areas. If you say you cannot attack an enemy that embeds itself in an urban area while attacking your urban areas, you're effectively saying, I can't fight you. I lose the war, which is what people were telling us, don't go into Rafah or don't go into the central urbanized areas in the Gaza Strip. They're basically saying lose the war because you can't win the war. You can't win the war. Hamas stays. We lost the war.
And I hope we can talk about, again, another uniqueness. ISIS, Al-Qaeda that I fought, they all know the laws of war. And they purposely do things like put themselves in hospitals, put themselves in schools and mosques.
Which is what Hamas is doing.
Yeah. I don't think Israel has found a hospital without Hamas in it.
Not only have we not found a hospital without Hamas in it, the hospitals turned out to be the central, I would say, the nerve centers for the Hamas terrorist system, either above ground and very often below ground. Below the hospitals and in the hospitals, we found weapon caches, we found ammunition, we found command and control posts, we found communication centers, we found money. This was it. I mean, basically the hospitals were it. So what do you say now? Well, don't go into hospitals. That's what people told us. And you know what? We were very careful when we went in. People said, you're going to kill the doctors, you're going to kill the patients. We didn't kill the doctors. We called the doctors. We called the hospital manager, and we said, we're coming in, make sure that none of your patients are in harm's way and so on. And we ended up taking the place practically with no casualties. But we can't say, okay, if you implant yourself in a hospital or in a school, you have immunity. That's crazy.
I mean, and I agree with you, sir. This is why I'm trying to be vocal on, look what happened. I mean, the reason that Hamas used hospitals is because ISIS used hospitals, Al-Qaeda used hospitals. Even the Japanese in Manila put themselves in a hospital.
I didn't know that.
Because it's the sensitivity that we all have human moral values, and the IDF have a special code in the IDF of that they're a just force. This is a just war being executed justly, and the world somehow just woke up to what war looks like, or woke up to first time in history that I've seen where the enemy goal is not to defeat Israel's military. It's in no way, it's only to buy time. And it designed its entire strategy.
It's to stop the war.
So how, sir, at your level, I mean, we say in places that I've taught that all war is just policy by other means.
Right.
How did you, and that war is a contest of wills. It's not, it is about killing. It is about destruction. There is no such thing as a bloodless war, but how did you maintain, especially with Israel's history, the will of the international community to continue the operation and to keep it going?
There are really two separate campaigns. And of course, they're intertwined. One campaign is the military campaign on the ground, which I think the IDF is doing brilliantly, and destroying the enemy's military systematically, while achieving results that are so difficult in this dense urban warfare, while also clearing the population out of harm's way in a ratio of civilians to combatants killed, which I think is really a world low.
Yep.
A world low. So that's one campaign, the military campaign. The second campaign is the diplomatic and campaign in the world to give us the time and the space to achieve the military campaign. That's not as easy as it sounds, but it goes through one basic place, and it's called the United States of America. Now, initially, we had the sympathy of the entire world when they heard of this horrible massacre, the raping of women, the beheading of men and women, some of them after they were raped, the burning of children, the massacre of entire families, the taking of hostages. This is equivalent to 50 or 20 9/11s proportionately in one day, 50,000 Americans murdered in one day, 10,000 Americans taken hostage in one day. So obviously the sympathy was with us around the world. But over time, because we incurred, the unavoidable civilian casualties, that are incurred in any war, and especially in this one, in which, despite our efforts, Hamas tries to use its civilians as human shields. Well, when you see those civilian casualties and they're broadcast around the world, obviously the international tide begins to turn. I said obviously, but happily, that's not the case in America, because I just saw a Harris poll that shows that 82% of Americans support Israel and only 18% of Americans support Hamas. And 2/3 of Americans, roughly 2/3, say that Israel has been taking special efforts to avoid civilian casualties. So I'm glad to see that my message and my policy is coming through to the American public. And that's the most important public. Now, I recognize there are pressures on the administration and people are trying to press it, and there are some radical fringes that are demonstrating all the time. Does that affect the American public? Apparently not. According to this Harvard-Harris poll, America stands firmly behind Israel. Now, I could lead these two efforts, the military effort and the diplomatic effort, because we enjoy in Israel overwhelming unity of the people. They understand that we have to win. They understand we have to eliminate Hamas. They understand we have to return the hostages, destroy Hamas, and build a different reality in Gaza. And there's such unity on this that it gives us, and me and the government, the power to conduct this dual campaign. But, you know, the jury is out. We have to finish the job.
Yes, sir.
You don't finish the job until you finish the job.
Because, and this is just from a military analysis, when do you define victory in the battle?
Well, when Israel can do, and the IDF can do in Gaza essentially what it's doing in Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank. That is, it could go anywhere at any time. You don't need a division. You don't need several battalions. It can go in with sub-battalion strength anywhere to eradicate the remaining or any resurgence of terrorism. When you destroy Hamas, Hamas's organized fighting formations, when you destroy the main elements, the main segments of their tunnel system, and when you basically are engaged in mop-up operations against individual terrorists. So you don't have a platoon of terrorists, you don't have a company of terrorists, you don't have a battalion of terrorists, you have individual terrorists. You can deal with that. That's how I define military victory. You've destroyed the enemy. You know, you could still have individual fighters. You remember you had this guy 30 years after World War II, still in the jungles in the Philippines, the Japanese soldier. I think his name was Hiro. You did, but it was clear you defeated Japan and you defeated Germany. You didn't have to kill the last German soldier or the last Japanese soldier, but you destroyed the regimes that were there, and that's where we have to do: destroy them militarily, and obviously eliminate them from any vestige of power.
What were your strategic or your goals at the beginning of the war, and had those changed?
They haven't changed, actually. The goals were, one, destroy Hamas, both militarily and as a political organization governing Gaza. Second, release all the hostages. And third, make sure that Gaza doesn't pose a threat to Israel. We're well on the way of destroying Hamas militarily, and if we destroy them militarily, we'll also destroy them politically, because they won't be there to threaten alternative forces who could emerge. You can't have an alternative force to emerge if they think that Hamas will leave, Hamas will come back and put a bullet through their head. So we're 2/3 on the way, at least, maybe 3/4 on the way of destroying Hamas. Second, we released more than half of the hostages, and we are engaged in constant efforts to get the remainder, and we will. And the third, we'll have to set up a post-Hamas Gaza, a system where Israel has the overriding security responsibility to root out any resurgent terror, and at the same time to try to create a civil administration that is not Hamas and not beholden to those who advocate the destruction of Israel and the use of terror. And that will take, first you have to have victory. First you have to have victory. You cannot win the peace if you don't win the war.
Yes, sir. And I know I used the word historic. I've said that, and I do believe, just based on the studying for over a decade, urban warfare, that Israel has taken more steps to mitigate civilian harm than other military. I mean, you evacuated 1.4 4 million, I think,
Right.
out of northern Gaza in a short amount of time. And then the IDF cleared thousands of Hamas fighters embedded in tunnels,
Right.
like an underground city, in only 2 months, when it took 100,000 Iraqi security forces 9 months to clear Mosul, with an overwhelming air support of the United States and the coalition.
And with no tunnel system.
With no tunnels at that level.
Yeah, well, then I can tell you that we're doing it because of the courage of our soldiers. They're just so determined to have this victory. They're so determined to make sure that Israel doesn't ever again suffer such a heinous attack, that they're prepared to fight and they're prepared to die. And one of the most moving things for me was to visit the soldiers who were lost limbs in our hospitals, and they are so strong. And many of them, some of them have lost a leg, even 2 legs, or an arm. And they say, as soon as we're given the prosthetics, we're going back to our units. And they say, whatever you do, Prime Minister, don't give up until you finish the job. That's how we can do it. That's the force we have. It's the will.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the will.
The will.
Without the will, you can't do anything.
I think Napoleon said that the moral is to the physical 3 to 1.
Right.
And I actually visited last month, and I've never felt, even though I served for 25 years and I've traveled to Ukraine, to wars around the world, when I came here and I went to the south and I saw giant tents of civilians, it was like the nation was unified in fighting the war together.
It's very much so, and I can't remember at any time that the spirit of our people was stronger, or that the people were more united than they are now. And that's obviously lost very often in the descriptions in the world press, which are outrageous. I mean, some of them are just outrageous. They just, basically they defame Israel. They vilify Israel. Of course, they vilify me, but that's par for the course. But they vilify Israel,
Right?
And they also, I think, they destroy morality because they don't draw the distinction. The main distinction in the laws of war is: do you deliberately attack civilians, or do you incidentally cause civilian casualties because they accompany every war? That's the first question you have to ask.
I think and
Hamas deliberately attacks, targets, mutilates, rapes, destroys, burns civilians, rockets civilians. And we, of course, do the opposite. We do everything we can to avoid civilian casualties. And the second thing is, are you taking enough measures? Well, you've just said that we take more measures than any other army in comparable situations has done in history. So I think this is so outrageous. I mean, the attacks, the vilifications on Israel and on an army are just a mark of Cain on those who engage in such vilifications.
I agree, sir. And as somebody who studied this again, I've never seen a war where the numbers are used as almost like a moral justification. I've never seen an urban war in general, to include the Battle of Mosul, where there's a number of civilian casualties on a day-to-day basis down to a single digit. I've just never seen it that is possible.
Well, that's directed against Israel, and there's so much hypocrisy here, and there's so many lies that are hurled against us. But that's why I'm so glad to see the overwhelming support for Israel among the American public. That's more than 4 out of 5 Americans support Israel, according to this latest poll, and that 2/3 are saying that Israel has gone out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. That runs against the whole course of this propaganda war that is being launched against us. Now, what's encouraging is that this is happening in the most important country in the world and our greatest ally, the United States. So I'm very much encouraged by the support, the broad-based support of the American people for Israel, and that's an important factor. The first factor is the people of Israel themselves, united as never before. The second is the overwhelming support of the American public, very deeply appreciated, and it's a factor in our war calculations.
I think one thing Americans that I didn't even know before I got into studying war and studying urban wars is that after the Yom Kippur War, the U.S. military commissioned over 30 studies of how Israel did the unthinkable
Reversing the tide.
Yes.
After a surprise attack.
Yes, sir. And most people don't know that it fundamentally changed the U.S. military. It changed our doctrine. We created air-land battle. It changed the top five in the way that we fought. Do you think that I think we will, and that's why I studied the battle so closely, is that I think there are many things here that are going to change the character of warfare. It could change it in a bad way if Hamas was, for some reason, successful in designing an entire city to make it so costly that you say you can't do it. But also that what the IDF have done in their urban warfare, their harm mitigation, I wonder how many studies will be done after this war and how it's going to change the future from how do you deal with tunnel warfare. I've seen some stuff that I just didn't think was possible, and I study this, on sending soldiers into tunnels to maneuver into them. What has surprised you, and are you going to, I'm sure that there's time for studying afterwards, but I'm almost already wanting to get into it. Like during this war, what has surprised you as?
Well, I think you touched on one thing that occupied our minds and our concerns before sending the soldiers in. To what degree could we enter the underground terror tunnel network without sustaining enormous casualties? And frankly, it turned out that we could enter it without sustaining enormous casualties, and indeed with sustaining very few casualties. And there are reasons why we could do that. I'm not sure that I can share with you some of the things that we developed in order to avoid that. But that has been, I think, a crucial difference between the execution of the directive of the government and our concern, initial concern, before we sent out the soldiers. We didn't know that we could do this to the tunnel network, what they're doing now in Khan Yunis and elsewhere.
Yes.
Basically taking it apart, taking out the central nodes that really count.
So there used to be in military doctrine, and I think people thought Israel can't do it. So there used to be in our doctrine that says you can't avoid and bypass urban warfare at all costs.
You can't.
It literally used to say that in print.
Gaza is urban. That's
right?
it.
And the world is urban. The enemy moved into urban.
Gaza is not, as you noted, the densest place on earth, but it's sufficiently dense. But
I fought in a battle of Sadr City, which was a neighborhood in Baghdad of 2 million.
Oh, okay. All right. So you know
yes, sir.
that when they say that Gaza is the densest place on earth, that's not true, but it's quite dense.
And now underground warfare, which I think after Yom Kippur, one of the findings of the U.S. military was Israel's ability to adapt.
Yeah.
What I was talking with this trip is I don't even think that's the right word. It's like Israel can transform itself.
Well, it did. I mean, we suffered a terrible blow on the first day. We sustained a surprise attack, which caused just enormous damage, and it's a big setback. But within a day, 2 days, we were already preparing for the counterattack.
Yes, sir.
And you say, can the urban warfare be avoided? No, because Gaza is urban.
Sir.
Hamas has taken and militarized through terrorist tactics, both against their own people and against ours. They basically militarized all of Gaza. So the only way that you can defeat Hamas is by going into Gaza. But going into Gaza required the development of techniques that some of them were actually perfected and are being perfected during the war itself. Yep. That is, the interesting thing to see is how the units, how the commanders, and how even the common soldiers make their suggestions to change tactics as we go along, and I think that's useful. But we cannot win this war until we complete the military defeat of Hamas, and that requires going into the last bastion, Rafah, and the central camps. 2 battalions in the central camp, 4 in Rafah out of 24. That's what's left. And then mopping up operations above ground against individual terrorists, while also doing the third component, which is the destruction of the main nodes of the underground terror system. That means rocket production sites, it means ammo storage sites, it means weapons, it means command centers, it means safe houses, it means computer centers. All of that is being demolished systematically. And of course, at the end, also getting the leaders. And we intend to do all of that. We have to do all of it. So if the world tells us stop, A, because you're incurring too many casualties compared to, to the world standard, that's simply false. Two things are wrong with it. Now, number one, if we stop, we lose, and the terrorists win. That means the Iran axis wins. It means America and its allies lose. And I think it has repercussions on a global scale, because people will see that this system, this barbaric system of using civilians as human shields, targeting civilians from civilian quarters, that will just expand. It will expand into the West, and it's very dangerous. That has to be stopped. And the second thing is, it's simply false to say that Israel is not taking enough care to avoid civilian casualties, when we're taking more care than any other army in history, and will continue to do so.
Yes, sir. I mean, facts are facts. Opinions are one thing. Facts are facts.
Well, there's a lot of false opinion out there with false facts.
Well, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you.